Lila Briarwood had a talent for blending in. At Crestwood Academy, nestled in quiet Oakhaven, Maine, she drifted through the corridors like a phantom, her slender build cloaked in loose cardigans, her blonde hair veiling her face like a soft mist. Most students barely registered her presence, and those who did often dismissed her as simply a shy girl who preferred her own company. Unbeknownst to them, Lila moved with the precise grace of someone trained to evaluate every space, every person. Her posture might have seemed reserved, but it was the disciplined stillness of one who had learned to observe before acting. The subtle sweep of potential escape routes whenever she entered a room, the way she kept her hands relaxed, these were habits honed through years of survivalist training that had little to do with shyness. After 2 months, Lila still felt like an outsider. Arriving in Oakhaven after her mother's job relocation was hard enough, compounded by the challenge of being the new kid who didn't quite belong. She had no interest in the gossip that consumed her classmates, preferring to focus on her studies and the occasional video call with her older sister who was studying zoology in Costa Rica. The initial sparks ignited in the library on a Thursday afternoon. Lila was sitting alone at a secluded table, quietly studying a book on wilderness survival, when she heard the booming voice of Gavin Thorne reverberating across the room. Gavin was everything Lila wasn't: imposing, boisterous, and seemingly the center of attention for every student. He was the captain of the hockey team and radiated the self-assuredness of someone who never doubted his place. "Check out the new girl," Gavin declared, his voice loud enough for half the library to hear. "Still solo, huh? What's that book about? How to Avoid People?" His entourage, Ethan Cole and Finn Baker, chuckled on cue, their laughter echoing like a pack of wolves. Lila didn't glance up, but her grip tightened almost imperceptibly on her book. She had encountered bullies before, during her travels with her adventurous mother. The best tactic was always to ignore them, to deny them the reaction they craved. But something about Gavin's voice, the arrogant way he spoke as if he owned the entire academy, made her fingers clench slightly around the edges of her book. "I'm talking to you," Gavin pressed, his voice gaining an edge when Lila didn't respond. "It's impolite to ignore someone trying to be friendly." Ethan, a lanky boy with the build of a basketball player, chimed in. "Maybe she's deaf. Maybe she's got those nature lover earplugs in." The comment elicited more laughter from their table, and Lila felt a flush rise in her cheeks. They knew nothing about her past, but the flippant way they mocked her interests stung more than she anticipated. Still, she remained silent, turning a page in her book with deliberate calm. This only seemed to fuel Gavin's irritation. He rose from his table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and started walking toward her. The library fell into the unique silence that descends when students sense trouble brewing. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Gavin repeated, now standing directly beside her table. He reached out and slammed the book shut, the abrupt sound echoing through the quiet library. "When someone's being nice, you should respond." Lila looked up at him for the first time, her blue eyes meeting his with a steady gaze that made him shift slightly. There was something in her expression, not fear, not anger, but a kind of evaluation that made him feel like he was being assessed by someone who had faced tougher challenges than high school drama. "I heard you," she replied quietly, her voice carrying a controlled tone that somehow made the words more intimidating than if she had screamed them. "I just have nothing to say to you." The dismissal in her voice clearly caught Gavin off guard. He was accustomed to reactions, tears, anger, defiance, but this calm indifference was something new. It made him feel smaller, and that made him angry. "You think you're better than us?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Just because you're some weirdo who travels all the time doesn't mean you can act like you're too good for this academy." Lila reached down to retrieve her book, her movements smooth and controlled. "I never said I was better than anyone," she responded, still in that same quiet voice. I just want to study in peace." But Gavin wasn't finished. Something about her composure, the way she refused to give him the reaction he wanted, made him feel like he was losing face in front of the entire library. He reached out and swept her backpack off the table, sending her notebooks and pencils scattering across the floor. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. "Looks like you made a mess. Maybe you should clean that up." The library was deathly silent now, every student watching to see what would happen next. Lila looked at the scattered contents of her backpack, then back at Gavin. For a split second, something flickered in her eyes, a flash of something that made Ethan and Finn take a subtle step backward. Then it was gone, and Lila was simply the quiet new girl again. She stood up, gathered her belongings, and walked out of the library without a word, leaving Gavin standing there with his victory feeling somehow empty. But as she walked away, several students noticed something that Gavin missed in his moment of triumph. Lila's stride was different, not the hunched shuffle of a defeated victim, but the measured pace of someone who was thinking, planning, waiting for the opportune moment. The incidents escalated over the following weeks. Gavin seemed to have made targeting Lila his personal mission, as if her continued refusal to break down was a challenge he couldn't ignore. He would brush against her in the hallways, always hard enough to send her books tumbling, but never quite hard enough to be considered assault. He would make loud comments about her clothes, her quiet demeanor, her lack of friends. Ethan and Finn followed his lead, creating a triangle of harassment that seemed to surround Lila wherever she went. They would block her path at her locker, making it difficult for her to reach her books without squeezing past them. They would save seats in the classes they shared with her, then move their belongings at the last second, forcing her to sit in the back where everyone could see her. The teachers seemed unaware of what was happening, or perhaps they simply chose to ignore it. Mr. Abernathy, the history teacher, would sigh when Gavin made his snide remarks, but never addressed them directly. Mrs. Davies, who taught English, seemed to think the boys were just being playful when they offered to help Lila with her assignments, missing the mocking tone entirely. But there was one teacher who observed everything. Ms. Simone Dubois taught advanced ecology and had only been at Crestwood Academy for a year. She was young for a teacher, probably in her late 20s, with a practical style that consisted mainly of hiking boots and comfortable sweaters. She wore her brown hair in a long braid and had a calm, thoughtful way of speaking that reminded Lila of some of the park rangers she had encountered during her travels. Ms. Dubois had been watching the situation unfold with growing unease. She recognized the signs, the way Lila carried herself, the controlled reactions, the careful way she navigated the academy. More importantly, she recognized the look in Gavin's eyes, the escalating nature of his behavior, and the way the other students were beginning to treat the harassment as entertainment. It was Ms. Dubois who first noticed the woven bracelet. Lila had started wearing it in early November when the Maine weather began to turn cold. It was clearly handmade, intricately woven from natural fibers with small beads and charms that seemed to tell a story. The bracelet was simple but elegant, and she wore it with a kind of respect that suggested it held deep meaning. Ms. Dubois had spent several years studying indigenous cultures before becoming a teacher. She recognized the bracelet immediately. It was the kind crafted by certain tribes in the Amazon rainforest, the kind that only came from years of tradition and cultural significance. The fact that Lila wore it suggested it had been given to her by someone special, someone who had shared their heritage with her. The bracelet became another target for Gavin's harassment. He would make comments about it being cheap, about Lila trying to look worldly when she was clearly just a sheltered little girl. He would tug on the strands when he passed her in the hallway, or grab her wrist when she was getting supplies from her locker. "What's with the trinket?" he would say. "Playing explorer in Grandma's jewelry." Lila's response was always the same: silence, that steady look, and then she would continue with whatever she was doing. But Miss Dubois noticed that her jaw would clench when Gavin mentioned the bracelet, and her hands would curl into fists at her sides before she consciously relaxed them. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon in December. Lila was walking toward the forest trails after school, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her hands tucked into her pockets to shield them from the cold wind. She was thinking about the upcoming winter break, about the research project she needed to complete, about the video call she would have with her sister. She didn't see Gavin, Ethan and Finn until it was too late. They had been waiting by the trailhead, apparently planning this moment. As Lila walked past, Gavin stepped out in front of her, blocking her path. "Hey, nature girl," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mocking tone. "Nice bracelet. Where'd you get it? A garage sale?" Lila tried to step around him, but Ethan moved to block her path from the left, while Finn moved to the right. They had her cornered between the trees and the trail entrance, with no easy way to escape. "I asked you a question," Gavin pressed, his voice growing harder. "Don't you think it's rude to ignore people?" "I just want to go hiking," Lila responded quietly, her voice steady despite the situation. "Please move." But Gavin was beyond listening to reason. Something about her continued composure, her refusal to show fear, had been eating at him for weeks. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward him. "You think you're so tough with this thing," he said, his face inches from hers. "Let's see how tough you really are." What happened next would be replayed in hushed whispers throughout Crestwood Academy for weeks to come. Gavin yanked hard on the bracelet, trying to pull it off her wrist. The delicate fibers, worn from years of use, couldn't withstand the sudden force. The bracelet snapped, the sound of breaking threads echoing through the quiet forest. But it was what fell out of the broken bracelet that made Ethan and Finn freeze in place. Small seeds, feathers and dried leaves scattered across the ground, tokens of nature, carefully collected and cherished. The items had been carefully woven into the bracelet like precious artifacts. Lila dropped to her knees, frantically gathering the items with shaking hands. For the first time since she had arrived at Crestwood Academy, her composure shattered. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched the broken bracelet against her chest. "That was my sister's," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She gave it to me before she left for Costa Rica. It was all I had left of her." The words hit the three boys like a physical blow. Gavin stood frozen, the broken bracelet still in his hands, suddenly realizing the gravity of what he had done. Ethan and Finn had backed away, their faces pale with shock. But Gavin, rather than apologizing, seemed to panic at the sight of Lila's tears. In his mind, he had finally gotten the reaction he wanted, and some twisted part of him felt justified. "Well, maybe you shouldn't wear weirdo jewelry to school," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "It's kind of strange." The cruelty of the comment seemed to break something in Lila. She looked up at him with eyes that were no longer sad, but blazing with a fury that made all three boys take an involuntary step backward. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "No idea at all." She stood up slowly, the broken bracelet falling from Gavin's nerveless fingers. As she rose, something fundamental seemed to change in her posture. The timid slouch was gone, replaced by the bearing of someone who had been trained to survive, to face down far more dangerous challenges than high school bullies. "You want to know about this bracelet?" she pressed, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My sister gave it to me as a reminder of our bond, of our shared love for nature. She worked for months to weave it, carefully selecting each item to represent our connection to the earth. She gave it to me to remind me that even when we're apart, we're still connected." Ethan and Finn were backing away now, sensing that something had shifted in a way they didn't understand. But Gavin, whether from shock or stubborn pride, stood his ground. "So what?" he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "That doesn't give you the right to act like you're better than everyone else." Lila looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was calm and controlled. "You're right about one thing. I've been acting like I'm better than you, but that's because I am better than you. I'm better than someone who would destroy something that means everything to someone else just to feel powerful." She began walking toward him, and something in her movement made Gavin's eyes widen. It wasn't the walk of a victim anymore. It was the deliberate advance of someone who had been trained to navigate treacherous terrain, someone whose calm demeanor was far more frightening than any angry outburst. "You want to know what else?" she pressed, still moving forward. "I've been holding back this whole time, not because I'm scared of you, but because I was taught that strength should be used to protect, not to harm. But you just crossed a line that I can't ignore." Gavin finally realized that he was in serious trouble. The girl walking toward him wasn't the shy victim he had been tormenting for months. This was someone who moved with the fluid confidence of extensive survival skills, someone whose calm demeanor was far more frightening than any angry outburst. "Look, I didn't mean," he started to say, but Lila cut him off. "Yes, you did," she said simply. "You meant to hurt me, to humiliate me, to make me feel as small as you obviously feel inside. The difference is, I know how to handle bullies like you." She was close enough now that Gavin could see the controlled fury in her eyes. Without warning, she moved, not with the wild swings of an angry teenager, but with the precise, economical movements of someone who had been trained in self-defense. Her first move was subtle, but effective. She stepped inside Gavin's reach and used a pressure point technique on his arm, causing him to yelp in pain and lose his balance. Before he could recover, she grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to his knees with a control hold that sent pain shooting up his arm. "This is called a wrist lock," she explained in a conversational tone, as if she were giving a lesson. "It's designed to control someone without causing permanent damage. The more you struggle, the more it hurts." Ethan and Finn started forward, but Lila's eyes snapped to them with such intensity that they froze in place. "I wouldn't," she said calmly. "I can handle all three of you if I have to, but I'd prefer not to. Your friend here has learned his lesson, haven't you, Gavin?" Gavin was gasping and trying to nod, the pain in his arm making it clear that he was completely at her mercy. Around them, other students had gathered to watch, their faces showing a mixture of shock and fascination. "I want you to understand something," Lila continued, still maintaining the hold. "I could have done this any time over the past 3 months. I could have ended your little game the first day you decided to make me your target. But I didn't, because I was taught that violence should be a last resort, used only when all other options have been exhausted." She released the hold and stepped back, allowing Gavin to slump forward, clutching his arm. But she wasn't finished. "Stand up," she commanded, and something in her voice made it clear that this wasn't a request. Gavin struggled to his feet, his face pale and his breathing still labored. Lila stood in front of him, no longer the quiet girl who had tried to disappear into the background. She was someone who had been trained to take charge, to project authority, to make others listen. "You destroyed something that belonged to my sister," she said, her voice carrying across the trail. "Something that represented our bond, our connection, our love for nature. You did it because you thought I was weak, because you thought I wouldn't fight back." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You were wrong about me being weak. But you were right about me not wanting to fight. I don't enjoy hurting people, even people who deserve it. That's what separates me from you." By now, a crowd had gathered. Students who had watched Gavin torment Lila for months were seeing her in a completely different light. Miss Dubois had also appeared, drawn by the commotion, but she made no move to intervene. She recognized what was happening, not just a fight, but a lesson that needed to be learned. "I want you to pick up every piece of my sister's bracelet," Lila continued, her voice steady and authoritative. "Every seed, every feather, every broken strand. And then I want you to apologize, not to me, but to the earth that those items represent. Gavin looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Lila's eyes made it clear that his options were limited. He knelt down and began gathering the scattered items, his movements clumsy and desperate. Ethan and Finn remained frozen, suddenly realizing that their friend had picked a fight with someone far more dangerous than they had realized. The girl they had helped torment for months wasn't just quiet. She was resourceful, disciplined, and capable of violence that they couldn't even imagine. As Gavin handed her the gathered items, Lila took them with careful reverence. She looked at each seed, each feather, as if she were seeing them for the first time. Then she looked back at Gavin, and her expression softened slightly. "My sister taught me that strength isn't about dominating other people," she said quietly. "It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. It's about respecting the earth, even when others don't. You could learn from that." She turned to walk away, then paused and looked back at the three boys. "This ends here. You leave me alone, you leave other people alone, and maybe you'll learn what real strength looks like. But if you ever, and I mean ever, decide to target someone else the way you targeted me, you'll discover that I have a lot more skills than what you saw today." The threat was delivered in the same calm, controlled tone she had used throughout the confrontation, but it carried a weight that made all three boys nod quickly. As Lila walked away, the crowd of students parted before her like water. The transformation was complete. No longer the quiet girl who tried to disappear, but someone who commanded respect through strength, resourcefulness, and moral authority. Ms. Dubois followed her, and when they were out of earshot of the other students, she spoke quietly. "Your sister would be proud," she said simply. Lila looked at her with surprise, and Ms. Dubois smiled slightly. "I recognize the bearing, the training, the way you handled that situation. Your sister taught you well." "She taught me that strength should be used to protect people, not to hurt them," Lila responded, echoing what she had said to Gavin. "I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted him to understand." "And now he does," Ms. Dubois said. "Sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to show them that they've picked the wrong target. But you did something more important. You showed him that real strength comes from restraint, from knowing when to fight and when to walk away." Over the following weeks, the dynamic at Crestwood Academy shifted dramatically. Gavin, Ethan, and Finn seemed to have lost their appetite for bullying, and other students began to treat Lila with a mixture of respect and curiosity. She was no longer invisible. People knew who she was and what she was capable of. But more importantly, she had found her voice. She began speaking up in class, offering insights that drew on her unique background. She joined the school's environmental club, where her knowledge of wilderness survival made her a valuable asset. She even started a mentorship program for younger students, teaching them some of the techniques she had learned for staying calm under pressure. The broken bracelet was beyond repair, but Lila carefully preserved the items that had been woven into it. She created a small display case to showcase the seeds, feathers, and dried leaves. A reminder of the day she had learned to honor her sister's memory, not just by wearing her bracelet, but by embodying the principles she had taught her. Gavin, meanwhile, had learned a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He began to understand that real strength wasn't about dominating others, but about lifting them up. He started volunteering at a local nature preserve, working to restore the trails and protect the environment. The confrontation on the forest trail became legendary at Crestwood Academy, but not for the reasons one might expect. It wasn't remembered as a fight, but as a lesson in dignity, resilience, and the true meaning of strength. Students who had once been bystanders to bullying began to speak up, inspired by Lila's example, and Lila herself had discovered something important, that her sister's legacy wasn't just in the bracelet she had given her, but in the principles she had taught her. She had learned that true strength comes not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when such strength is necessary and the restraint to use it only when all other options have been exhausted. The quiet girl who had once tried to disappear had become someone who stood up not just for herself, but for others who needed protection. She had learned that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from defeating your enemies, but from teaching them to be better than they were. 23,440 characters.